has been providing sorely needed medical supplies to countries around the world, but the aid hasn't always been received with open arms. Is this China's problem? Is there any way China can help without being criticized? And with a population of 144 million, Russia says it has fewer than 3,000 cases of COVID-19. How has the country been fighting the virus? Welcome to The Point, an opinion show coming to you live from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. As the COVID-19 has infected over 750,000 people worldwide and killed more than 36,000 people, China has provided assistance to countries in Europe, the Middle East, Africa and Asia. Yet recently concerns, even skepticism, are growing over China's motivation. Some are warning about China's so-called mask diplomacy or politics of generosity. Others are highlighting so-called quality problems with Chinese-made medical supplies. So why have China's humanitarian efforts drawn so much criticism, and what can be done from all sides to promote cooperation in the face of this common crisis? Joining me for the discussion from Philadelphia, the U.S., via Skype is Blackburn-Dwyer, founder of Grasshopper Strategies, a consulting firm, and in Beijing, Einar Tangen, current affairs commentator. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. So Chinese motivation being questioned, or shall I say being questioned again, as we are talking. By the end of March, the latest official figure is that China has provided assistance to over 120 countries and 4 international organizations, and yet Western skepticism over Beijing's motive seems to be rearing its head. For instance, Joseph Borrell, the EU's foreign policy chief, sounded alarm, saying Europe must be aware there is a geopolitical component to the crisis, including a struggle for influence through spinning and the politics of generosity. There have also been worries about China selling its pandemic narrative and promoting its political system. So, Brandon, I want to go to you because I don't understand this. What kind of mentality could that be? Because a person is drowning, obviously, and another person is extending a helping hand, but the person who is in water is asking, hey, why are you helping me? Is there something fishy, suspicious behind it? How do you look at it, Brandon?
Unfortunately, we live in a skeptical world. We live in a cynical world. Aid of any sort, going back eons in human history, has been greeted with both open arms and skepticism. Whether that was historical countries helping each other, whether that was the United States rising in soft power in the 20th century and distributing aid across the planet to the developing world, whether that was attempts to help China in the 80s and 90s, or China helping the world now, there is always going to be an element of people that read past the generosity and think forward to a cynical view of politics. And that's unfortunate. I'm not going to say that they're wrong. I'm definitely not going to say that they're right. But the reality is, helping someone in this day and age comes with a twofold response: praise from some, criticism from others. And that's the reality of a multifaceted political world that we live in.
So you say it is understandable that you should expect it, but on the other hand, I'm kind of noticing a particular strong attention or particular bright spotlight on the motivation of what China has been doing. Einar, do you also observe the same thing, or is it just some people or some Chinese people's impression that the world is really scrutinizing too much the Chinese behavior?
Well, there's no question that, there's a political hand being played over, and it's affecting people's lives. I mean, this is a life and death situation. America needs 300 million masks a day, and they cannot even provide it to their first responders and medical staff. I think in terms of what needs to happen, though, I would disagree a little bit with Brandon. You can say this is the way it is, but history has a way of looking back at those who were trying to help and did help, as opposed to those who had cynical motives. So I think when history will be the final judge of what China's generosity was, and I think that is the lesson to take away. Always do what you think is right. Don't worry about all these naysayers.
I want to put this question exactly to Brandon, because just now we hear this suspicion of China's motivation by Mr. Joseph Borrell. I'm pretty sure probably he is not in dire need of a mask. He's not on the front line trying to save people. For those people who are desperately needing a mask, I don't think they're going to say, wait a minute, there's something wrong behind these Chinese masks. There's something suspicious or, you know, some ulterior motives behind these Chinese masks. Brandon.
Well, I think Einar has sort of highlighted a certain point here. What perspective are we looking at the situation? Are we looking at this in real time with current events, where current events are always full of the back and forth and the debates about motives and what is the long-term impact? Or are we looking at this from probably what history will judge? And I would actually agree with Einar that historically we will look back on this and say that China played a significant role in helping the world handle and come out of the COVID-19 pandemic, because China, with its experience on the front line, being at the beginning of this epidemic, at this pandemic, is sort of positioned well to be able to help the rest of the world with advice, with consultation, with material, with a workforce that is one of the first globally to be able to return to work, hopefully safely, to be able to provide many of these much-needed supplies. Historically, China has been a central producer of medical goods, and when we come to testing things, that has historically been centered in the EU and the US, but as we need more testing kits, those workforces are quarantined at home, and it's hard to safely ramp up production in the US and EU, so we need places like China that have sort of already started to come out, at least indicatively, the other side of this pandemic, to provide these much-needed supplies. So long-term, I think we will see this as a very positive role, a very crucial role in handling this pandemic. But the reality is, if you look at anything with a one-day or a 24-hour news cycle angle, there's always going to be people just arguing about everything.
Right,
in the United States, we're seeing it with governors arguing about aid from the federal government. It's happening everywhere.
That's unfortunate. That's unfortunate. But on the other hand, there is also the kind of feeling that when the domestic governments or when the domestic system have been doing rather a bad job of handling this crisis, the easier thing is to look aside and say, look, you know, it's China. Either they didn't provide us with enough information early enough, or you know, they're giving us faulty testing kits that's hindering our attention, hindering our efforts. Einar, what do you think are some of this kind of factors behind the finger pointing or criticism of China's humanitarian efforts? Do you also see any of such elements in there?
Of course they're there, but the issue is here is that you have governments who are trying to, you know, cover up, in essence, their own incompetency. They flubbed this. They had 2 months to prepare. They did nothing. They minimized. They denied. They tried to have an amelioration strategy where they thought, well, we'll just let it run through the population. It'll be kind of a herd immunity. Then when they realized the seriousness of it and they were going to be exposed for having done nothing politically, they decided that they would all gang up and say, well, oh, China, it's all China's fault. They didn't do enough. They should have told us more. These are the kind of things that you would expect from a 14-year-old on the playground being caught not doing their homework. The dog ate it. You know, it's somebody else's fault. It's really disgusting. It's just there's no other way to put it. People are dying, and these people, as I've said before and will say again, are playing politics in order to avoid the responsibility for their own incompetence.
And avoid getting help that is just the most available at this moment. And as I said, some critics were skeptical of China's motivation, some saying there could be possibly some strings attached to such aid so that these European countries would be forced to underline China's narrative of wise leader or successful political system. But reality is this situation has been contained pretty much in China under the leadership of the government, of course with the joint efforts of the Chinese population as a whole. So Brandon, my impression is that it's almost politically incorrect to acknowledge that China has done a reasonably successful job, or China can do a reasonably successful job in anything. So, you know, they simply cannot call a blade, Brandon.
Okay, well, there are elements of any group that are going to have hard and fast rules that are just going to believe that China's bad. I've often spoken against those, whether on this program and other areas. But I want to highlight even President Donald Trump, who is largely known and I think leading some of the elements that Einar is talking about in terms of blaming China and blaming pretty much anyone but himself, has at times said very positive things about President Xi Jinping's ability to quarantine, lockdown, and early on have some benefits.
Do you believe
in fighting this. It's hard to know. Moment to moment, he's praising China or blaming them. But moving beyond President Trump, because he's very difficult to pin down on this, let's talk about the rest of the world. We have a bunch of different narratives. We have a political narrative. We also have a very specific case with the testing kits. The testing kits are one where there are facts on the ground. The facts on the ground are we have a desperate need that leading everyone to rush out supply of items that even the Chinese government have acknowledged have not gone through enough domestic testing. We can then look at the narrative related to those facts. The narrative on one hand, the cynical one, is that these are people profiteering. The other narrative is these are people trying to help and they're doing whatever they possibly can to help, and if there are mistakes made along the way in that, then we need to think of that as a good Samaritan practice, which we forgive mistakes made in the effort to help. But the reality is we have facts on the ground, which we have testing kits that aren't nearly as effective as we need across the world. We need better screening of those goods coming out of China and coming into a lot of places. And that's not China's fault, per se, because I'd really, truly like to believe that there's no intent ill will here. But the reality is we have a massive 700,000 a day test kit demand that really no one at this point is poised to fulfill except for China. And even when China's fulfilling it, it's having to do it by rushing out products that may or may not be fully ready for market use. And that's the conundrum we find ourselves facing, a global pandemic that really no government on the planet was, frankly, at all prepared effectively to do this, with maybe some of the exception of some of the actions known in Asia, but even that early on did not look nearly as prepared as it should have been.
Well, I think these are some salient observations. As a matter of fact, you know, in an effort to scramble to step up your production capacity, of course you're in a kind of disorderly manner, and as things progress, more regulation, more coordination will come up. As this has been announced on Wednesday, for instance, according to China's Ministry of Commerce, that starting Wednesday, domestic exporters of medical products, including COVID-19 testing kits, medical face masks, medical protective suits, ventilators, and infrared thermometers need to provide extra documentation when they go through customs clearance. The document, either in print or digital form, should contain a declaration that the products have been officially registered in China and meet the quality control standards of respective export destinations. So we actually go into the second issue here, not just not the motivation behind China's assistance, but in technical details. How can qualities be guaranteed, and whether any defective products would be held accountable against the Chinese government, as have been the cases in some of the Western media so far. Einar, how do you look at some of the disputes, frictions that we have seen concerning so-called qualities of or functions of Chinese-made?
Well, it's complete nonsense. I mean, quite frankly, anything that the government has supplied or given has been absolutely standard. No one has any complaints about it. What has happened is people tried to make deals with people they didn't know in China through intermediaries, whatever, and of course, yeah, they didn't know what they were getting. They bought uncertified merchandise, or they didn't understand what they're getting. They weren't getting test kits that were frontline test kits. They were auxiliary test kits. Instead of understanding that, they turned around, they made a bad deal, and then they're saying, oh, it's the Chinese government. How is the Chinese government responsible for deals made by private entities? It's as if China were blaming the U.S. because some fraudster cheated somebody over here. I mean, it's a constant refrain that anything that bad that happens in China is the government's fault, whereas it's never anybody's fault if a private entity does it in the West.
Absolutely. If you read about any of these products in the news, it's always said, you know, medical or testing kits imported from China don't function well, and people immediately say, well, look, made in China, bad quality, you know, what, did we not know that? Brandon, again, do you expect that to happen, that this is understandable, or really there's something wrong here?
all of this is understandable. We're rushing out equipment overnight in a situation that is very difficult to do it. When we compare, say, testing kits to, say, ventilators, ventilators are right now being built by car companies, largely because ventilators are at their core a very mechanical item. So the quality control on ventilators, while incredibly strict and incredibly necessary to be that strict, are actually easier to manage and easier to spread and ramp up production than, say, something like a testing kit. Testing kits that some of these testing kits are sourcing materials across multiple different countries. For instance, a lot of the testing kits in China that are coming out and they're saying, hey, we're not fully ready yet, part of the shortage is that the world's leading manufacturer of swabs for testing kits is located in northern Italy, and they've been shut down since the beginning of the pandemic, reaching Italy. So we have a global supply chain that is struggling and buckling at times under the overarching demand that we need to save lives. And I like to think that most people are going at this the right way, but the reality is, in the time of crisis, as we try to rush out supply, there will be problems. And when there are problems, people are going to take out their frustration on those problems. And
on
people
China.
Are sometimes taking it out on
That's
China.
The problem.
And,
yeah,
right,
they take it out on China, on the Chinese government, on the Chinese system, on the Chinese people.
That's where the supply is coming from.
That's where the supply is coming from. If something faulty comes out of the United States, do people say, well, it's the United States that's responsible for a faulty product, or this U.S. company?
They do. They say both. They say if the United States were supplying, but the reality is the United States is not supplying it because there's not enough supply.
It is always China as a government, as a country, as a people that are associated with these problematic products. And that, I think, is a problem that many people do not seem to realize. Einar, am I being too cynical? Am I being too sensitive?
No, I don't think so at all. I mean, Brandon, the right answer is it's wrong. I mean, you just said yourself that the U.S. is depending on China to produce these things, and yet they're vilifying it. You're saying, well, it's all understandable in the moment and the heat and things like that. But, you know, it is still wrong. China is offering a helping hand, and instead, you know, people are criticizing and biting it. It's very, very difficult. I just hope that China will be a much better person than them and continue to offer the kind of aid that is necessary because, you know, quite frankly, the U.S., I'm a U.S. citizen. I feel really bad for my country. But the fact is we are medically the number one in the world in many respects. We have the most expensive system in any event. And truthfully, you start looking at India and other nations who don't have anywhere near this. And, you know, it's a shame that so much attention is being paid on a country that had 2 months to prepare for this, did not, and is now blaming everybody except themselves for what's happening.
All right. Well, Brendan, 10 seconds for you. Do you have something to say to that before I wrap up?
All I'm going to say is that it's in one breath we can say that China is doing all this great aid, but on the other breath we're saying it's coming from Chinese companies. I think the narrative needs to be decided. Is it Chinese companies making these mistakes, or is it China as a country taking credit for all the great supply that's going out to the world that is needed to save lives?
I hope
that
not.
is the difficult narrative.
I hope not. I believe that distinction has to be made. Government-to-government assistance, cooperation, private sector, Chinese individuals, Chinese people, NGOs. I think this distinction has to be made. Nobody should be taking credit for all of that. Okay, we have to leave it there. Many thanks to Einar Tangen and Brandon Blackburn-Dwyer.